Thank you all for being here tonight. My name is Enda Brophy, and I teach in the School of Communication here at SFU. I want to begin by acknowledging that tonight's lecture takes place on unceded Coast Salish territory, including the traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. My colleague Dal Jin is going to introduce tonight's speaker shortly, but I'd like to spend a minute or so discussing this annual event and the scholar whose memory we're here to remember. Each year, the Smythe Memorial Lecture honors a critical scholar whose work has made a mark on or has important implications for the political economy of communication. Dallas Smythe was a professor of communication at SFU from 1976 till he passed away in 1992. He's now recognized globally as a leading scholar of communication processes as well as a founding figure of the political economy of communication. Almost 3 decades from his passing, Smythe's work is more relevant to the contemporary media landscape than ever. Smythe's scholarship was deeply marked by his personal history. He was born in Canada and trained as an economist in the United States before returning after being blacklisted for belonging to pacifist and social justice organizations during the Cold War. Smythe's political convictions only intensified over the course of his life. Dallas Smythe's work was driven by a concern for how the domination of media channels by corporate interests impoverished the cultural lives of citizens, workers, and common people. I think Dallas would be thrilled that a lecture in his honor this evening is exploring the contemporary ramifications of this concern in an era of social media disinformation. So I have a few more thank yous tonight. I want to thank the School of Communication, the Faculty of Communication, Art, and Technology for supporting this event. I want to thank Brenda Baldwin and Grace Huey for event organization and communication. I want to thank Chris Jaselnik for taking care of the recording of the lecture so that it can be made available on our school's website. And thanks also to the student volunteers and Arlen Barrett who are making this happen. A couple of things to let you know about. After the talk, there's going to be a Q&A, so stay around for that. And after the Q&A, there will be a reception right around the corner with food, so definitely please stay around for that.
Okay, thanks, and good evening. Welcome to the 2019 Dallas Smythe Lecture. My name is Dal Jin, professor in the School of Communication. And I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Victor Pickard, a good friend of mine. Victor and I studied at the Institute of Communications Research at the University of Illinois, in which the Dallas Smythe worked first before moving back to Canada. We both studied political economy, history, and the media policy. My focuses were Asia, his focus was of course the United States. We also worked as the TA for the Robert McChesney's the political economy of communication. I took their 4 classes with the Robert McChesney, and Victor and of course has been one of the finest media scholars, and they are a good human being, no doubt. Victor is now the associate professor at the Annenberg School for the Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. Previously, he taught at the New York University in the Media Culture Communication Department and worked on the media policy in Washington D.C. as the senior research fellow at the Media Reform Organization and the think tank. He also taught media policy at the University of Virginia after their graduation in 2008. His research focuses on their history now, political economy of media institution, media activism, and their politics, and the normative foundations of their media policy. Victor is one of the author of the over 100 book chapters, articles, and the essays on the subject only within his 10-year career after graduation. So then I cannot believe this the huge amount of the work that he has done. Victor is the author of their several books, including America's Battle for the Media Democracy, published by the Cambridge University Press, and their forthcoming Democracy Without Their Journalism to be published by the Oxford University Press, and their Net Neutrality, a New Deal for the Digital Age, to be published by the Yale University Press. He is also editor of their several books, including The Future of their Internet Policy, Media Activism in the Digital Age, with their Bobin Yang at their same institution. Victor's work, therefore, has been published widely in their scholarly journals, including Critical Studies in Media Communication, Journal of Communication, Media Culture and Society, Global Media and Communication, International Journal of Communication, and the New Media and their Society. Victor sits on the editorial board of the 10 major communication journals and their book series. And he has received numerous articles and their book award. The story continues. But today, Victor will talk about the rise of the Misinformation Society at the Dallas Smythe lecture organized by the School of Their Communication. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Victor Pickard.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Jen. Jen and I go way back TAing for Robert McChesney's class. It seems like many, many years ago. I want to thank Simon Fraser School of Communication for inviting me and bringing me out here. I especially want to thank Enda and Brenda Baldwin and many others who did so much of the labor in putting this talk together. I also want to thank all of you for coming out this evening. This is such an honor for me, such a privilege to be here in Vancouver, and any opportunity I have to come back to Canada, I always jump at it. I'm not actually Canadian, but I think of myself as reclaiming roots, or trying to reclaim roots when I come back here, because my grandfather and namesake was Canadian. He was actually in the Olympics for Canada back in 1924, 1928. And anyone who will listen to me, whether they want to know or not, I'm very fond of informing them of this information, especially that I'm a quarter Canadian. I can't say that Canadians are tremendously impressed by that information, but nonetheless, I'm very proud of it. My children are very proud of saying that they're 1/8 Canadians. So, a more specific reason why this is such an honor for me is because I regard Dallas Smythe as my intellectual grandfather, or perhaps my great-grandfather, depending on how we divide the generations. The political economic tradition is one that I claim as my own, and I've always been inspired by Dallas Smythe's work, especially his constant engagement with the policymaking process and his critical analysis of how power operated through media systems. He taught the first political economy communication course in North America at our alma mater, as Jen mentioned, and while I was doing my doctoral studies there, I always felt like there was this kind of lingering radical spirit of Dallas Smythe, not just Dallas Smythe, but also Herb Schiller and Tom Guback and many other critical political economists who preceded them. And I always felt that there was this commitment to not just scholarship, but also activism. And that's something that I've tried to embody in my work. In fact, I actually went through all of Dallas Smythe's papers for my dissertation research here at the other campus, the one on the Hill. I spent quite a few days there going through all of Dallas's papers, and I feel like I'm still mining many of the gems from those archival materials. I will refer to this a little bit in my talk tonight. The last thing I'm going to say about Dallas for now is that I think he represented a very important but often marginalized critical tradition within the broader field of communication, especially in the United States. And I think this tradition is well suited to confront many of the structural problems facing us and facing our media systems today, things like concentrated power, unaccountable monopolies. So I think that Dallas Smythe's work is more relevant today than arguably ever before. So with that, I'm going to dive right into my talk, which focuses on the United States media system. And even though there is a US centrism to what I'm talking about, I'm certainly not holding it up as the ideal. In fact, quite the opposite. I'm treating the US media system as a cautionary tale for what democratic societies should not do. They should not design their media systems in the same way that the US has. And I think many of the problems that we're grappling with in the US, I think it'll become clear very early on in my talk that these are problems that other countries are grappling with as well, especially here in Canada. Our media institutions are deeply implicated in many of the challenges facing us today, whether we're talking about inequality, climate change, or the future of democracy. A reliable information system is absolutely essential. We all learn this in school, and yet we very rarely contemplate the necessary policies that keep that system, the press, intact. There's been increasing concern about the health of our information systems, especially concern around misinformation and disinformation, but all too rarely do we contemplate the structural roots of misinformation. In the US, we hear a lot about Russian interference in social media, growing distrust and lack of interest in our news media, growing polarization and partisanship, but there's less focus on the systemic characteristics that enable and amplify this misinformation. An entire misinformation infrastructure has been allowed to emerge over time. Policy decisions and indecisions, actions and inactions have degraded our media environment and created what might be termed, what I like to call, a misinformation society. So I argue that there are three broad failures that have enabled this misinformation environment. The first one might be thought of as the unregulated information monopolies problem, also known as the Facebook problem. A second media policy failure is regulatory capture at the FCC, that's the Federal Communications Commission, which is the agency that oversees much of the American media system. I think the FCC now is exhibiting the characteristics of a textbook scenario of regulatory capture, where a regulatory agency internalizes the logics and value systems of the industries it purportedly regulates. So this has translated in the United States to a recent merger mania, as well as the loss of net neutrality and many other structural problems. Basically, you have an FCC now that's performing customer service for the industries that it purportedly regulates. So I'm going to be talking about these two media policy failures off and on throughout my discussion this evening, but mostly, and I probably will end up ranting about Facebook at some point. I'm saving a lot of this for my public seminar tomorrow, so that's a quick plug. If you have a chance, please come by, and I'll be talking more about the dangers of monopolies. But most of my discussion tonight is going to focus on this third policy failure, which is a lack of support for what might be called public service journalism, the accountability journalism. That refers to the local journalism, policy reporting, investigative journalism, the things that democracy requires, and it's exactly those kinds of journalism that are disappearing, especially in the United States, but I have a sense that you're seeing many of these same or similar problems here in Canada as well. And I should note that all this is coming out of my current book project that is finished and will be coming out at the end of the year, but it's still in need of a lot of revision. It's sitting on my computer or somewhere out there in the cloud. So I'm really looking forward to the Q&A later on. I could use some help in revising my book, so I'm going to try to crowdsource it a little bit during our discussion. I promise not to talk too much about this character. I'm sure you're hearing enough, seeing enough of him in your own news media. We certainly can't escape him in the United States. But I would argue that his election revealed a number of structural pathologies in the American media system. It's always important to underscore the fact that Donald Trump is not the cause of our problems. He's symptomatic of these pre-existing structural problems, especially in our media system. And I think the 2016 elections helped bring into focus a number of relationships between democracy and media and various publics, as well as the role of government in managing those relationships. So several meta-narratives emerged after the elections. The first narrative, this was almost an immediate reaction when people were trying to make sense of how this happened. Many people would blame news media institutions for enabling Trump, for giving him far more attention than the other candidates. Now, this especially pertained to television news media, but also applied to print news as well. Trump's commercial appeal led news organizations to give him far more attention, to basically give him billions of dollars worth of free airtime, and basically elevating his campaign. News media indulged in false equivalence, sensationalized and trivialized the elections with horse race coverage and an obsession with personalities and polling data instead of offering critical analyses of candidates' policy positions. Typical news coverage constantly reported on who's up, who's down, what are the polls telling us now, what outrageous thing did one candidate say about another, and so on. One study by Thomas Patterson at the Shorenstein Center at Harvard found almost a complete absence of policy-related news and campaign coverage. And again, this was true especially for television news, but also in our elite print news outlets as well. There was almost no coverage of policy positions. Another study showed that Donald Trump received 3 times as much news coverage as Hillary Clinton and 16 times more than Bernie Sanders. Now, these are all grounds for concern, but much of this criticism focuses on the symptoms, again, instead of the underlying structural causes. We need to look at the underlying economic imperatives, namely the constant chase for ratings and advertising revenue, this commercialism that's driving so much of the American media system. Covering Trump was money in the bank for commercial news outlets. The now disgraced CEO of CBS, Les Moonves, famously or infamously said about the Trump campaign, "It might not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS." That was an exact quote, "damn good for CBS." I was going to use that as a title of my book, but I was talked out of it. Maybe I will. The second narrative, in tension with the first, is a newfound appreciation for the Fourth Estate. Many people increasingly see news media institutions as our last line of defense against everything from fake news to fascism. For many, as Trump attacks the press, calling them the enemy of the people and similar things, worse things, public sympathies naturally redound to news organizations. One result was a Trump bump, where many publishers saw sudden and dramatic spikes in subscriptions. However, except for the largest news organizations, this desperately needed boon quickly tapered off, and it never really addressed these underlying economic problems facing the newspaper industry, which I'll get to in just a couple minutes. So this leads us to the third, more long-standing narrative that despite our need for public service journalism, it's precisely this kind of journalism that's disappearing just when we need it most. The market's failure to support the journalism that democracy requires deserves far more attention. And this is especially true regarding the newspaper industry. There's always this reaction that, we should just let the dinosaurs die. No one's reading newspapers anymore. Something else is going to take their place. Well, the fact is nothing else is taking their place. And even in their beleaguered state, newspapers still provide, this is certainly true in the US, and I think it's at least somewhat true in Canada, newspapers still provide most of the original reporting and new information that circulates through the entire media system. Even here in Canada, I know they play a very central role in your media ecosystem. And so when we lose newspapers, we really are losing journalism. It's always, the discussion is never about saving newspapers, it's about saving journalism for the future. So after covering some political and historical context, I'm going to focus on how we can sustain this kind of journalism. And I'm approaching these questions, as is only appropriate for the Dallas Smythe lecture, through a political economic lens, which focuses not just on business models. It's often the first thing people think of when they hear political economic analysis of journalism. They assume we're going to just geek out over business models. But no, it's more than that. It's about looking at big picture concerns. It's about looking at the normative role of journalism in a democratic society, the broader political relationships. And it leads me to ask questions like, what are the structures that enable or constrain journalism? How does journalism figure within not only larger political relationships, but how can it better serve democracy? And I think this is a key question. And to this last point, I really want to emphasize that whenever we're talking about the future of journalism, it really shouldn't be about saving journalism as it now exists. It should be about reimagining what journalism could be, about completely reinventing it. And that's what I'm trying to focus on. That's my not so hidden agenda. And to use a perhaps overused phrase, it's not just a crisis, it's also an opportunity. And that's how I think we should approach the journalism crisis. Now, I want to step back for a moment for some really broad context. I think it's safe to say that commercial media systems around the world exhibit some similar characteristics, but the American media system is in a category of its own. In many sectors, it's dominated by a handful of corporations, you might call them oligopolies. It's only lightly regulated in terms of public interest protections. We no longer have, for example, the fairness doctrine. Some of you may have heard of that. And it's largely commercial. We have only very weak public alternatives to offset commercial excesses throughout the rest of the media system. Many countries, many democracies around the world face one or two of these challenges. I think here in Canada you probably face about two, but very rarely do you have this perfect trifecta. And to demonstrate this last point about our impoverished public media system, this draws from Rod Benson and Matt Powers' data from a few years ago. The US government allocates about $1.35 per year per person towards their public media system. Sometimes I see the calculation closer to about $1.40, so that gets you to about a very cheap cup of coffee. If you throw in local and state subsidies, that'll get you closer to about $3.75, and now we're talking about maybe a latte. Canada doesn't do that well compared to some of the other countries, but still much better than the US. Japan gets up to about $50 per person per year. The BBC is close to $100. Northern European countries like Denmark and Finland are well over $100 per person per year. So the US is literally off the charts. It's a global outlier among democracies for how little it spends on its public media. And it's only getting worse. A few years ago, Sesame Street, which is the most famous show produced by our public television, I grew up on it. Americans typically have warm, fuzzy feelings about Sesame Street. Sesame Street was privatized a few years ago. It was leased off to HBO. And at the same time, Donald Trump and his administration have been trying to phase out whatever existing government support is still there. They haven't been successful yet, but they keep trying. And this keeping our public media system so impoverished is forcing them to further debase themselves so that they're more reliant on advertising and corporate sponsorship. If you sit down and watch public television in the United States today, you're bound to see commercials. They're often euphemistically called enhanced underwriting. Even if you're listening to NPR or public radio, you're bound to hear some radio advertisements throughout any program. And in fact, NPR is even resorting to what's called native advertising, which is deeply problematic, and I'll talk about native advertising in a few minutes. But what this ends up doing is that it erases the distinction, the entire rationale for having a public media system in the first place. So why does this matter? Without a strong public media system, I would argue there's no safety net. There's no real public option for when the market fails to support journalism. Now, one example of where there is a safety net, the BBC has assigned 150 democracy reporters, that's what they call these reporters, assigning them to news organizations throughout the UK. So basically, allocating resources at these struggling news organizations to focus just on local journalism. In my view, that's exactly what a public media system should be doing in a democratic society. Recognizing where there are failures with market support, recognizing where there are gaps, and supporting those institutions that democracies require. Now, in the US, most commercial news organizations, whether we're talking about cable news, broadcast news, online news, they all rely on revenues from delivering eyes and ears to advertisers. I think Dallas Smythe had something to say about this. He had some very important insights about the relationship, about the audience essentially doing labor for corporate, for media firms and advertisers. And that's pretty much what's happening. In the US, it's always been about an 80-20 split for the newspaper industry. So that means about 80% of their revenues came from advertising, about 20% from other sources such as subscriptions. That's changing a little bit. The New York Times now only gets about 40% of their revenues from advertising. But still, compared to most industries around the world, US journalism has been inordinately dependent on advertising revenue. So these structural factors, an over-reliance on advertising, few policies that can correct against commercial excesses, and virtually no public safety net, these all combine to create a news media system in the US that's subjected to unmitigated commercial pressures. And this leads to specific vulnerabilities and biases. And it created the perfect conditions for a structural journalism crisis. Now here, I want to pause just for a second, because one of the interventions that I'm trying to make in my book is to argue that journalism has always been in crisis. It wasn't just the advent of the internet. It wasn't. You often hear people in the States blame Craigslist for taking away all the classified advertising revenue that newspapers often relied on. That's really unfair. It's unfair to Craigslist, but it also misses the broader structure critique, which is that commercial journalism was always structurally vulnerable. It's always been in crisis. There's always been this tension since the dawn of the commercialization of the press between the press's public service mission and their profit-seeking mission. And this tension has been negotiated in various ways, in many ways often just trying to hide it, trying to obscure it. And advertising revenues was able to do that for many years. Now, the modern American journalism crisis in a nutshell, after I just gave this long spiel on how it's really been this historical process, but more recently, and I think many of you already know this, but it's worth just going through it really quickly. In a nutshell, as consumers and advertisers have migrated to the web, where digital ads pay pennies to the dollar of traditional print ads, this 150-year-old revenue model for commercial newspapers has collapsed. It's beyond repair. It's never coming back. But because this economic relationship has been around for so long, it's often assumed as the natural order of things, and alternative models typically fall beyond our imagination. With the collapse of the ad revenue model, there have been fewer revenues, which means fewer journalists. The number of news workers has declined by over half since the early 2000s. Newspapers are declaring bankruptcy, closing down, reducing home deliveries, or going online only. There are a number of major US cities today that lack a daily home delivered newspaper. In fact, my hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the Post-Gazette has now been reduced to just 5 days a week home delivery. So I'm going to flash a couple of fairly depressing graphs showing some of this. This is newspaper revenue. This data was coming from the newspaper industry itself until about 2012. They stopped making this data public, which I think is probably understandable. The optics were not very good for the newspaper industry. So the Pew Research Center stepped in with its projections, and we know that it continues to go down. It's lost tens of billions, the newspaper industry has lost tens of billions of dollars in just the last decade, and it continues. In fact, I could just be flashing numerous graphs right now that are all kind of going like this, showing circulation, revenues, and number of employees all plummeting. Now, one bright spot had been digital advertising revenue. There was some modest growth in this area, but right now, almost all of that revenue is going to two players. Can anyone guess who those two players might be? Facebook, Google. You nailed it. I should have warned you at the beginning. I'm going to have these pop quizzes periodically throughout my talk. So yes, the duopoly, the Facebook, Google duopoly, now gobble up almost all the advertising revenue. By some estimates, at least 85 cents of every new dollar. Some would even say more. And in general, this is true both in the US and Canada. About 70% of all digital advertising revenue is going to the duopoly. Amazon's trying to creep in there, but they're still pretty far behind. Now here you see, again, a 50% decline, over 50% decline in news jobs since 2000. And once again, there have been a bright spot in some of these new digital outlets like BuzzFeed, Vox, Vice. But if you've seen any recent reports coming from the States in the last 6 months or a year, you'll notice that even these jobs are beginning to disappear fairly rapidly. And I think we're going to continue to see this slide. A lot of these new digital outlets were being floated by venture capital based on this hope that native advertising would pay off, and now many people are beginning to see that this was not a winning business strategy. So I think we're now seeing money leaving the digital news sector. So the last thing I'll say about this, in 2016, the Pew Research Center, which is sort of the gold standard in the US, it puts out this annual report on the state of all of our news media. It came out in the conclusion of its report saying, quote, "This accelerating decline suggests the industry may be past its point of no return." So for the Pew Research Center to say this, and they usually will find a silver lining, they'll usually find something to be hopeful about. For them to come out, this was of course now almost 3 years ago, where they just said there might be nothing we can do to save the industry, that speaks volumes. And if this were true, you'd think we'd have a national conversation about this, because it's a serious social problem. But thus far, there's been little such discussion and virtually no public policy response. Here in Canada, you've had much more robust discussion about this, and of course, you've been talking about subsidizing the press, which I'll mention again in a little bit. In the US, there's been almost no discussion. It's almost thought of as journalism being something beyond the reach of policies. It's not seen as a social problem, and therefore it's not seen as a policy problem. So as news organizations continue to cut costs and chase ever-diminishing ad revenue, a number of concerns rise to the fore. This first one that I keep mentioning, native advertising. This is where you often will see an erosion between the distinction between news content and advertising content. So there might be little small print that says this news article is sponsored by such and such corporation. But study after study shows that readers typically are deceived by this. They don't notice, they don't realize that the story has been co-produced by a self-interested corporation. In other contexts, we would probably call this, if not propaganda, it's certainly branded content. It's something that we should know about as we're reading. Leading news organizations have placed so much emphasis on this strategy that many of them now actually have in-house advertising agencies, basically their own shops, where they tailor advertising campaigns to mesh with what they call news products. I always bristle at this phrase, news products. Like, shouldn't we think of it as a service, not a product? So this enhanced coordination, both tailoring advertising to fit the news, but tailoring news to fit advertising campaigns, this coordination is deeply problematic. But I would argue that advertising that relies on behavioral tracking can be even more ethically problematic. Tim Liebert and I, my former advisee, conducted a study a few years ago showing that news organizations are among the worst culprits in exposing readers to third-party advertisers and data brokers online. So we looked at the 100,000 most popular websites, and we compared. Then we zeroed in on 2,000 news-related websites, and we found that news websites exposed people to over twice as many as average to these third-party data brokers. And many of these data brokers might be absolutely harmless, but many of them are not. The New York Times, on a good day, might expose, according to our analysis, might expose readers to 44 third parties without their knowledge. But beyond whether these third parties are dangerous or not, it's entirely unregulated in the United States. There's almost no oversight. And there's any number of ways where our privacy is being violated without our knowledge. So for several years I had this line where once you had advertising-supported journalism, increasingly you have journalism-supported advertising. But even as much as I like this line, it's becoming increasingly less true. I think news organizations are actually realizing that this is not going to pan out for them. I don't think we're going to see native advertising disappear tomorrow. In fact, it's probably going to get even worse in the foreseeable future. But increasingly, news organizations are scrambling for other revenue streams because the advertising model is not coming back. It's doomed. So this other concern about degraded journalism, growing precarity and casualization of journalistic labor, this is talking about not only fewer jobs, but lower paid jobs with fewer benefits. We've all heard this phrase, starving artists. I keep waiting until we start hearing about starving journalists. It's really become quite atrocious, even though there are some bright signs of unionization efforts. A lot of digital newsrooms across the states are beginning to unionize. But nonetheless, there's greater reliance on freelancers and stringers as well whenever we're talking about international journalism. Now, also, there's this loss of particular kinds of public service journalism, and we're starting to hear this phrase, news deserts. That's a metaphor that we're hearing about increasingly often in the United States, where you have vast geographic regions and entire issues that are going completely uncovered. Now, these news deserts and news divides disproportionately affect communities of color, lower socioeconomic neighborhoods, and rural areas. According to one analysis, 500 rural newspapers have closed since 2004, and there are now about 900 communities in the United States that have no local journalism whatsoever. Now again, we should ask the question, why does this matter? Does this matter at all? It sounds somewhat intuitive, but it's only been in the last few years that we're starting to get a lot of data back. There have been a lot of studies looking at what happens when a local newspaper shuts down. And these studies are showing that those lacking access to reliable local news are less informed about politics, less civically engaged, less likely to vote. Without local journalism, there's also less accountability and a rise of corruption and mismanagement in local governments. Also, communities become more polarized as they rely more on national news. So there are all these tremendous social costs, and I want to bring this back up later on when we start talking about like how can we pay for alternative forms of journalism. But for right now, I think obviously this does beg the question, what alternatives are there to the advertising revenue model to support journalism? And way back in 2011, with a very cheerfully titled book, Will the Last Reporter Please Turn Out the Lights? Robert McChesney and I went out, this was at the height of the modern journalism crisis between roughly 2008, 2011, when the financial downturn really accelerated a lot of the problems facing journalism. And so we went out and asked many of the leading scholars and practitioners who were focused on the journalism crisis to contribute their analysis of the nature of this crisis, but also talk about what's to be done about it. What can we do to stop this crisis? And I don't know what it says that many of the models that emerged from this book then are the same ones we're hearing about today. All the chapters that we had in this book, I think we had something like 30 essays, they all fell in these 4 buckets. And I think at least 3 of these 4 are still very much in our discourse today. So the first one, the obvious one, paywalls, very intuitive. This idea that, okay, if advertising isn't supporting journalism, then we should be paying for journalism. And it sounds great, and in some cases it works. But in many cases it's not working. It's not supporting smaller newspapers. It's not even supporting large metro dailies. It seems to be working for papers like the New York Times or for niche outlets. So certainly in some cases it might generate this desperately needed revenue, but it's certainly not a systemic fix. And I would throw in this category micropayments. There's also membership models, which again I think Proponents of membership models want to say it's different from paywalls, but it all falls into this subscription kind of model, and so far it has only borne very mixed results. This second area, this second bucket, citizen journalism, which sounds very, very appealing, and this idea, this was especially, I think, prominent in the earlier days of internet utopianism, when we were still hopeful about what the internet could do for democracy. And the idea was that, we all have these, we can all be our own journalists, we all have access to Twitter, we don't need institutions anymore. We can evolve past these old news organizations. And I think a lot of that has faded out of the discourse, although you'll still hear a little bit about crowdsourcing. And every once in a while, like in the last year, there was a lot of hope that that Bitcoin and blockchain and cryptocurrencies might save journalism. So you still occasionally will get people who think, there's got to be a technological fix to this problem. But I think thus far, at least, we're not seeing that. This third bucket, the benevolent billionaire model, I would also include foundations in this model. And again, there are some very exciting experiments that we can point to in the United States. We have things like the Texas Tribune, ProPublica, we've got The Intercept, Voice of San Diego, many exciting experiments, and I expect to see more in the coming years. But again, this is not a systemic fix. This will not get at the news deserts problem. And there's all kinds of research coming out now showing all the constraints about how donor funding affects the content of journalism. It's often not long-term. And it also begs the observation that not all billionaires are benevolent, right? Oftentimes I'll mention Sheldon Adelson as Exhibit A. He bought the major newspaper in Nevada and turned it into kind of his political plaything. So this model doesn't always pan out. So this brings us to the last and least discussed model, public media subsidies. And it's often written off as a political non-starter. When Americans hear this phrase, media subsidies, they just drop into fetal positions. But in fact, I think you could argue, I certainly argue, that media subsidies are as American as apple pie. If you go back to our first major communication system, which was the postal system, you'll see that we heavily subsidized that system. And back in the 1700s and 1800s, the primary objective, primary purpose for that system was to deliver newspapers. So essentially, in many ways, was the internet system of the 1800s. And even the internet itself is the product of massive public subsidies. So in various ways, government has always been subsidizing media in the United States. So what I would argue, and one other point about that, many democratic societies subsidize newspapers directly. They have direct print press subsidies, and these countries are not sliding into any kind of totalitarian dystopia. So I think it's something that we need to consider, certainly as it becomes increasingly clear that there is no commercial model for journalism. And that's one of the arguments that I think should be fairly obvious by now, but we're not quite there yet in the US. This idea that there is no entrepreneurial solution here. We're not going to solve the news deserts through a market-based model. And we've wasted precious years trying to seek out these models, and hopefully we're starting to realize that we need to focus on non-market-based models. Now, a recurring argument in my work is to try to figure out try to show that how we think about media is historically contingent, and that before we expand the debate about the future of journalism, we need to know this longer history to figure out where this trust in the market and this fear of affirmative media policy comes from. I've always rejected this argument that Americans are just naturally libertarian, that it's something in our water or the air that we breathe, and we're just born libertarian. I think there's a lot of historical evidence to refute that, but yet the way we think about journalism in the US today is very libertarian, and I've tried to figure out where is this coming from. And I'm going to take a quick detour into some historical analysis, and this is I'm just for a few minutes going to talk about my last book, which tried to get at the historical and ideological roots of the American media system. And I had a hunch that this media system was not entirely determined in a democratic manner. And as I dug deeper into the archives, I found that many aspects of the American media system trace back to a cluster of policy battles in the 1940s, a critical juncture when social movements, media institutions, and regulators struggled over defining journalism's democratic role. And there was this brief moment at the Federal Communications Commission where there was a critical mass of progressive commissioners. And Dallas Smythe played a very important role. Of course, he was the first chief economist at the FCC. He arrived, I believe, in 1943. I would place this golden era of progressivism at the FCC between 1939 and 1948. And during this time, the FCC tried to cut down on excessive advertising, break up media monopolies. This is where Dallas Smythe was instrumental. They actually broke up NBC. They broke it into two. That's how we ended up getting ABC. But I won't leave you in suspense. These efforts were largely unsuccessful, largely because of red baiting and an anti-communist hysteria that took hold in the US right after World War II. And yet, reformers were able to win some public interest protections, like the previously mentioned Fairness Doctrine. The 1940s also saw a surge in media criticism, and much of it actually sounds pretty familiar, pretty similar to things that we hear today, including concerns about excessive advertising, corporate bias, propaganda, media concentration, and a loss of local journalism. There was actually congressional hearings on the disappearance of community newspapers back in the 1940s. They were worried about newspaper chains basically buying up all the newspapers. So within this context of growing media criticism and concern about the role of media in a democratic society, we see the formation of the Commission on the Freedom of the Press, better known as the Hutchins Commission. You may notice that one of these folks looks different from all the others. That's Ruth Inglis, who was actually one of the primary authors. She was the primary author of one of their major reports, and yet she was never given full-fledged commissioner status. She was often seen as, as kind of the coordinator. So quite obvious from this picture. It was made up of entirely all white men, mostly upper-class white men. Many of them taught at Ivy League schools, and no journalists, which became a real problem later on when they were trying to defend their findings. They were tasked with defining freedom of the press and professional norms for journalists. And few people know this. I do only because I slogged through thousands of unpublished documents and proceedings. But the Hutchins Commission initially considered some pretty radical reforms. They entertained notions like subsidizing news startups in communities that had only one newspaper, forming community press councils, treating the press as a utility or a common carrier. However, as they began to stray into this very radical structural critique and coming up with these non-market-based solutions, they became fearful that they were sounding like socialists, and they retreated and fell back on more industry-friendly recommendations, things like the press should be more accountable to local communities, should cover issues and events that are very important to the public, and so forth. But it was overall a fairly tepid set of recommendations, especially looking at their earlier critique of the failures of commercial media. And yet, despite these pretty lukewarm recommendations, the press pounced on them, called them communists, and basically dismissed them for daring to critique the laissez-faire relationship that the press sort of took for granted. And yet, interestingly, a number of years later, the Hutchins Commission, even though it had been somewhat, had fallen into a certain degree of obscurity, was kind of rediscovered by this seminal book that is commemorated in this plaque. Jin might recognize this. This is outside of our hall, Gregory Hall. This commemorative plaque that basically is basically crediting these three University of Illinois professors, including Wilbur Schramm, who's one of the founders of the field of communication in the United States. These three authors as defining the social responsibility model of the press. That, according to this book, Four Theories of the Press, this replaced the earlier libertarian model. Now, I would argue, and others have said some similar things, that really this was just a rebranding process. It was taking some of the lessons from the Hutchins Commission, further watering them down, and basically saying that the press had discovered social responsibility, and now we don't have to worry about things anymore. The press has got it covered. So here, I'm going to reduce my entire book to one slide. What I refer to as the post-war settlement for American media. I would argue that these policy battles in the 40s resulted in a social contract between the state, the public, and media institutions. It was defined by three features: self-regulation, industry-defined social responsibility, and a negative understanding of the First Amendment. First Amendment is something that we're tremendously proud of in the United States, but it's normally understood in very libertarian terms. It's usually understood as keeping government off our backs. So really enshrining this negative freedom in the Isaiah Berlin sense, instead of a positive freedom, this freedom to or freedom for, the idea that the collective, that the community should have some collective rights, should have access, guaranteed access to a rich and informative media system. All right, that's not enshrined in popular understandings of the First Amendment. Instead, it's this libertarian notion. And this kept in place a commercial media system with little public or governmental oversight or challenges from non-commercial media. And this framework largely remains the dominant paradigm for American media policy today. And I think you need to know this history to see that it wasn't inevitable, it wasn't natural, it could have gone differently, and that means it could still go differently in the future. I refer to this ideological arrangement as corporate libertarianism, and it assumes that government has little legitimate role in intervening in media markets. But this, of course, is a libertarian fantasy. The government is always involved in our media systems. It's a question of how it should be involved. Government's involved in spectrum management. It's involved in intellectual property law. There are so many ways that government's involved in our media every day. It's really a question of, are they representing public interests or are they representing corporate interests? So a lot of these questions bring me to my current book project with another very cheerful title. I'm really trying to understand why there has been no public policy response to the journalism crisis. And I think part of this reason is that market fundamentalism has seeped into the master categories of how we think and talk about journalism. And the fancy academic term I use for this is market ontology. That basically structures how we understand the role of journalism, how we understand the nature of journalism. And I'm just going to go through some of these discursive impediments I think have prevented us, especially in the United States, from seeing journalism, the journalism crisis, as a social problem that should be confronted with public policies. And one is this idea that journalism is treated as a simple commodity that's bought and sold on the market, not as a vital public service. And the implication is that if journalism isn't profitable for publishers and media owners, then we should just let it wither. Now imagine if this same logic were applied to academic work. If our peer-reviewed journal articles didn't receive enough clicks or likes, then we would have to do something different. We would have to change our research trajectory, or maybe we would even lose our jobs. Even worse, imagine if we applied this same logic to our public schools. If our public schools were not profitable, then we would simply have to close them down. This is basically the logic that we are applying to journalism on a daily basis. If newspapers aren't profitable, then they're doing something wrong, and the market is just sorting it out. Now, the last thing I'll say about this, according to this whole supply-demand framework, in fact, there is still a lot of demand for journalism. It's just simply not profitable or profitable enough. Now, this second discursive trope The institutional collapse of journalism is beyond our control. It's something that happens to us. It's often treated as a natural disaster or divine intervention. For analysts like Clay Shirky, it's a kind of creative destruction. We're living in a revolutionary moment, he says. Things get broken. We have to wait for something new to organically emerge. Now, if there was an invasive force, an invasive army that closed down our newsrooms and force-marched journalists out onto the street, there would be open rebellion. If Donald Trump did any of this, there would be, now there's all this concern that he's saying these nasty things about the press, but if he started closing down newsrooms, I think there would be an insurrection. But when the market does this, there's a kind of sociology of resignation, of disempowerment, that there's really nothing to be done. The free market is just doing its thing, and it's beyond our control. So this brings us to the third and final trope, this idea that market forces and new technologies will combine to guide us out of this predicament. And paradoxically, even though the economics of the internet are the trigger that basically led journalism into its latest throes of existential crisis, these same forces are often assumed to be journalism's sole saviors. Now, there's less of this utopianism now, but I think this is something that we still, again, blockchain. Don't ask me how that was supposed to work, but a lot of people think that it still might. Now, obviously, new technologies and their affordances can help, but these efforts need to be guided by sound public policy and public input. And another important caveat here is that there is still a lot of good commercial journalism all the time. There are amazing stories being produced by the commercial press. But I think the challenge is to extricate the good parts, to extricate good journalism before the market drives it into the ground. And I haven't even mentioned yet the role of private equity firms and hedge funds, firms like Alden Global Capital, which are buying up struggling newspapers and immediately undergoing radical cost cutting, basically trying to bleed them out for as much profit as they can before quickly selling them. This is sometimes called vulture capitalism, which I think is a very apt term for it. Now, fortunately, there are some political economic rationales for policy intervention that we can turn to. And these are coming straight out of neoclassical economics. I mean, I think we also could reach into the Marxist toolkit as well. And certainly some of these ideas like systemic market failure, I think are very compatible with Marxist critique. But in many cases, I think it might be useful to look at neoclassical economics and look at arguments coming from this dominant economic framework that show that there actually is justification for government intervention, that there is at least some recognition, although most of these neoliberal economists would see it as a very rare event where the market isn't working well. But nonetheless, there is an allowance for instances where the market fails and government must intervene. So, for example, this notion that news and information should be seen as public goods, that journalism is not a widget, it's not a simple commodity. The information produced by journalism has special properties. Because public goods are non-rivalrous, one person's consumption does not detract from another's, and non-excludable, which means they're difficult to prevent from free riders. This is especially true whenever we're talking about digital media. Many public goods, things like artificial light, clean air, parks, even knowledge, also produce tremendous positive externalities, benefits that accrue to parties outside of the direct economic transaction. Society requires these goods, but individuals typically undervalue, are unable, or unwilling to pay for it, leading to their underproduction and systemic market failure. Now, there's been progress here, and I think there are many scholars now who will say journalism is a public good, and I think that's great. But saying that journalism is a public good and then dropping the mic, that isn't enough. We need to extend that analysis to say, actually, there is ongoing market failure here. And when there's market failure, that's basically a structural flaw that justifies, indeed necessitates, policy intervention into media markets. And market failure is simply this idea that the market's inability to efficiently allocate important goods and services. And one vulnerability with the traditional commercial model was that news was a kind of byproduct of the transaction between advertisers and media owners. Advertisers never really cared if news organizations maintained foreign bureaus or whether there was reliable local news. Advertisers were trying to get at markets, were trying to get at eyeballs. And the easiest way of doing that was to go through the newspaper, which often had a local monopoly. So advertising itself in this scenario was a kind of subsidy. And today we need to find a way to replace that subsidy. We have to figure out a way to save journalism from systemic market failure. So here we're at the what is to be done portion of tonight's programming. And I have far too much written on this slide, but basically I'm arguing that there are 5 general approaches to removing news production from the market entirely or minimizing commercial pressures. And one is to establish public options, again trying to expand non-commercial and non-profit media. And this includes a well-funded public media system, but it also includes the necessary infrastructure, things like municipal broadband. There's a growing movement in the United States that communities should build their own broadband networks. And here, just as a side note, I really think we do need to be discussing more about the digital infrastructures. We know that journalism's future is a digital one, so that means we should be talking more about internet policies in the context of the future of journalism. Things like net neutrality. A world without net neutrality is a very hostile world for journalism. If not in the same sentence, at least in the same paragraph, we should be talking about net neutrality in the future of journalism. This also applies to having access to broadband services. This phrase, the digital divide, sounds so 1999, but it's still a huge problem in the United States. By conservative estimates, about 1/5 of all households lack broadband access. Some people would say it's much worse than that. So we should be subsidizing broadband services. We should be breaking up, preventing monopolies and oligopolies from starting up in the first place, to encourage competition and diversity and to lessen profit maximizing behavior. I'm going to be talking about this a bit more tomorrow in the public seminar. Regulating news outlets via public service obligations. This is inherently controversial recommendation. It's one that I have sort of mixed feelings about, but at the very least I think we should mandate that news organizations are accountable to the communities they serve. This number 4, enabling worker control by unionizing newsrooms, facilitating employee-owned institutions, reestablishing professional standards that buffer journalism from business operations. This is absolutely essential. So basically allowing journalists to be journalists and giving them a role in the governance of their own institutions. There's a very important history of the Newspaper Guild in the 1930s in the US. It was a very radical unionization effort. And it wasn't just about improving work conditions, but it was really about redefining freedom of the press in entirely democratic terms. So I think this is something we should be looking at more closely. And then 5, the last one, community governance of newsrooms. Again, getting at this idea that as we think about these new institutions, we really should be thinking in entirely different terms, ideas of how the newsrooms should look like, should reflect those communities that they serve. This would rapidly enhance diversity, but it also should include communities being involved in the news-making process, that really they should be co-producing their own news content. And I think this would change. This also gets at the problem around trust. I think if communities were involved in making their own news, a lot of the problems around trust would at least lessen. So just one more. So 2 questions always come up whenever we're talking about subsidizing media. One is, how do we prevent these public media institutions from becoming just mere mouthpieces of the government? And I think there are I think democratic societies around the world have figured this out, but I think there are many safeguards and firewalls that we can put into place, and we can make sure that these news organizations are always content neutral, are always ideology neutral, that government does not have control over them. The second question that always comes up is, well, how would we pay for it? And I think we could look at a number of possible solutions that could generate the necessary revenue for an entirely new public media system. One is to leverage already existing public infrastructure. And here I'm talking about things like post offices. So in the United States, in almost every small town across the country, there is a post office. And we could be converting those public spaces into community media spaces. And I get this idea actually from the Urbana-Champaign Independent Media Center, which did exactly that. It bought the downtown post office in Urbana, Illinois, in the middle of the cornfields, and now houses a local LPFM station, a community broadband network. It puts out a monthly newspaper. So I think that just gives you an idea. I mean, really this is about expanding our imagination about what this new public media system could look like. We also could be it's not the sexiest thing, but we could be tweaking tax laws to make it easier for newspapers to transition into nonprofit and low profit status. And we could be creating a journalism trust. Again, begs the question, how would we pay for that? Well, there are a number of ways, and of course, the Canadian government has come up with some very interesting ways for subsidizing the newspaper industries here. I think we should be looking at similar plans in the United States, but we also might consider doing things like taxing the duopoly, Google and Facebook. It's tragically ironic that they are starving the very institutions that they expect to fact check for them of their sustenance. They're taking all of their advertising revenue, so maybe they should be paying into a journalism trust. I actually made this argument in a piece I wrote for The Nation about a year ago. Other people like Emily Bell, British media reformers, have been calling for similar plans. Free Press, media reform organization, just put out a report where they call for taxing all targeted advertising, which would yield somewhere between $1 and $2 billion a year that could go towards supporting public media. So there's no shortage. I could think of a dozen other ways where we could be generating revenue for this kind of trust that could then allocate resources towards news deserts. There's just a shortage of creativity and a shortage of political courage. So really quick, because I want to get to the Q&A section, I just wanted an excuse to flash this picture that represents the monopoly problem in the United States. It's actually from 1899. This picture, I don't know, it's some kind of like, it's not really an octopus, but whatever it is, it's a scary monster. And it represents the oligopolies and the trusts that were dominating every sector of the economy in the US at the turn of the century, going into the early 20th century. And we are again, these battle days are here again in the United States, where in every sector it's dominated by monopolies. So many of these, and especially in the telecommunications and various media sectors. So I think this is something we need to grapple with. I'll be focusing on this more tomorrow. I'll be talking about the Facebook problem tomorrow. I love ranting against Facebook, but I'm going to restrain myself for now. I actually, despite all this doom and gloom, we can return to that in the Q&A if you want to. Despite all these depressing factoids I've been throwing out at you, I'm actually weirdly optimistic right now. I think that the fact that so many of our media system's structural problems being out in the open now, it's encouraging people to connect the dots. It's actually, I think, just reading mainstream media now, I'm seeing good political economic analysis on a daily basis, and that warms my heart. That gives me hope that long-held assumptions about whether government is allowed to rein in monopolies are beginning to shift. That younger people are not as enthralled to the market, and I think there's good reason to dare to dream that we'll begin looking for real alternatives to the commercialism that has misguided so much of our media for so long. And on that cheerful note, I'm going to end. Thank you very much. I look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Victor, for your talk, for your optimism. We do have time for some questions. There is a mic about halfway down this extraordinarily long room. So I would ask you, just for the convenience of everyone else in the room, to line up at the mic if you have a question to ask Victor. Thank you.
I'll get things started. I'm Catherine Riley. I'm an associate professor in the School of Communication here. And I wanted to ask, this is not my field, and so I found this a very helpful overview and introduction to these themes. And I wanted to ask about whether demand for news has stayed constant through all of this. So the question there is, is the quantity and quality of demand shifting as a result of competition from other sources of media that's arising with the internet? And then related to that, Nick Coldry has an argument that news uptake and attention is related to people's perception that they can create real policy change. And so if they don't feel that they're actually getting listened to by governments, then they just put their head in the sand, is one of his arguments. And I wanted to ask your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question. I feel like we should applaud that question. It's, yes. So there are a couple of really good questions in that question. The first one, so this often comes up, this idea, and often, it's sometimes framed as, is this a supply side problem or is it a demand side problem? And one of my interventions is to say it's, at least I want to focus a little bit more on the supply side, but that doesn't mean that I'm not concerned. Like, I don't assume if we just build it, they will come. So I think that you're absolutely right to question whether there still is the same kind of demand and what needs to be in place to encourage that demand. So going back to something that I mentioned earlier, I would like to believe that if communities, and I think you're absolutely right, it's sort of a learned helplessness. I think many people do not engage because especially in the United States, they rightfully see that their opinions are not impacting policy. In fact, Timothy Wu had a piece in the New York Times, I believe it came out today, that argued, it's not a right versus left argument. It's more of a top-down, that basically people are feeling shut out of government, and that policies are basically meant to keep people out of government. There's another important analysis that basically says the U.S. is an oligarchy. It should no longer, this was like mainstream political scientists saying that we're really, by textbook definitions, no longer a democracy. Long-winded way of saying that I think we would have to change the news media institutions for there to be more demand. And I think just like if people feel disempowered, that their voices aren't being heard, and they're not going to be engaged, if they see how they're involved in the newsmaking process, I would like to believe that would change. And there was a second part to that great question that I'm forgetting. I did? Okay. All right. Thank you. And I welcome people to push back on anything that I said, because I covered a lot of ground, and I think I should be taken to task for some of the things I said. So, and like I said, I need help revising my book. Yes?
I'm just reminded that he who pays the piper calls the tune. In Canada, we had a history at the time of the country's founding that the political parties each kind of sponsored a paper. And so at that time, the powers that be were basically running the journalism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And now we have in Canada CBC.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering if that was the model that you were kind of referring to for the United States to create its own UBC, USBC. But also, in New York, there's a fellow by the name of Michael Bloomberg who owns a media company. And if you're in the financial business, you pretty much have to pay a couple $1,000s a month. And you get the news that's relevant to your business, and you're paying for it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's possible to get for some people to support the media that they need. It's just that perhaps if there's a need for a CBC too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Those are really great observations. I agree with all of them. And the first one, this idea that there was an earlier subsidy model that I didn't even mention, which was the partisan press era, and that's when news was being subsidized by political parties. And it again underscores this historical constant that news has rarely paid for itself. It has always been subsidized in one way or another. Also, you mentioned a version of the benevolent billionaire model, whether it's Michael Bloomberg or Jeff Bezos or whether it's Pierre Omidyar. When it works out, it can be a beautiful thing. Many people, myself included, thought when Bezos bought the Washington Post, I was deeply concerned. I wrote an op-ed that I'm glad I didn't actually publish, which is called something like When Newspapers Become the Playthings of Billionaires. Well, actually, there's been some good, overall, it hasn't turned out to be quite as problematic as we feared with the Washington Post. The last point that you mentioned, I think, is also very key, is that for people who can pay, they can still get access to very reliable, to top-notch reporting. There was a great piece in the Washington Monthly a couple of years ago that pointed out, even though there's all this concern about the dismantling of Washington D.C. news bureaus, that in fact there was more journalism happening in Washington D.C. than ever before. It's just that usually you would have to pay a lot of money to access these niche outlets that were very specialized. Now, of course, this exacerbates already existing socioeconomic divides in the U.S., that the wealthy will have access to very excellent, the most excellent journalism that's out there, and everyone else doesn't have access to that. So you have this kind of news redlining that occurs. So thank you. Those are all great observations. I think all symptomatic of these broader structural problems. Yes.
Thank you for an excellent lecture.
Thank you.
One problem that occurs to me is if you're interested in democracy and you regard the media as the prime basis for democracy, which I happen to agree with, what do you do about the situation in the States where rich people like the Koch brothers are bypassing the public and the media altogether and simply writing the legislation through various institutes such as ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and the American Enterprise Institute?
Yeah, wow, that's. I thought I was dark, but that's very dystopian, and it's absolutely correct, I must say. Yeah, this is another example of where there isn't a simple panacea. Even if we were to have a revitalized fourth estate, it's not going to get at some of these pre-existing structural inequities where we have these private tyrannies, like some of the institutions that the Koch brothers have developed over time, and the control they have. Again, this idea that the U.S. is now an oligarchy. I think there's a lot of compelling evidence for this. And yet, I would say that just as when you have fascism, you always have anti-fascist movements emerge. Now, just when you have monopoly control and wealthy control, plutocracy over our government, you're also seeing a resurgence, especially among young people. Socialism is no longer a forbidden idea in American society. So there's been a real discursive shift. And regardless of what you think about socialism, I just think that that's indicative of these broader shifts that are happening, that I'm actually I'm somewhat optimistic, oddly enough. But it still doesn't get, we're going to have to find ways to redistribute wealth one way or another, or otherwise we're going to be stuck with the Koch brothers who will be able to capture government.
So I'm a student and don't love microphones, so I'll just speak loudly. I do appreciate the strides that we've made within Canadian media to sort of have some entities that are separate, but I think it is important to acknowledge the ways in which, especially native media, sort of inseminates within our own media organizations. Like, for example, I work at Royal Columbian volunteering with the Hospital Foundation, and there was one day that we had CTV in to do an interview precisely because CTV is owned by Bell Media, and Bell Media, of course, wanted to push their Let's Talk campaign. So they did do interviews within our mental health institution for the purpose of pushing their Let's Talk campaign, not because they found it important. In fact, the reporter groaned at the fact that he had to do it, but because the owners wanted to push their agenda forward rather than push journalism. So I think that we need to acknowledge our own problems here in Canadian media, not just in the US. And I think it's being overshadowed a lot by the American journalism problem.
Thank you very much. And of course, I should have noted at the very beginning, I would like to talk more about the Canadian media problems, but I just don't, I'm not an expert in that area. So it would be kind of disingenuous of me to, because not always being lacking expertise will not always prevent me from talking about something, but I would have talked more if I had known about it. I often hear, I know, for example, the CBC, it was mentioned earlier, would I want something like that in the American context? And I know that the CBC also has many problems and flaws, and it's not a perfect model. Sometimes when I hear about those flaws, I wish that we had those problems in the United States, but nonetheless, I certainly don't mean to suggest that it's just American problems that we should worry about.
I'm not saying you specifically, I think that's in general.
Oh.
It's sort of a broader point, to talk about it more, especially since in that moment, like, no one would have ever known that it was sort of an agenda being pushed in that media piece.
And I agree, that's just to your point, I think media criticism is something we should encourage as a civic duty. You know, you hear media literacy thrown around, but I think we have to put public pressures on our media institutions. And so that's not necessarily a policy intervention, but that's still a very important bottom-up social process that I think we all should be engaged in one way or another. Yes.
Thank you for the lecture. Now, I know your area of specialty is democratic media. I'm a Turkish journalist, actually. And
Okay.
I'd like to point out, yeah.
Yes, doing God's work.
I'd like to point out that, you know, I'd like the optimism that if media gets, you know, crushed, that people take to the streets. They don't really. They come to Canada instead. But
Yeah. True.
But
Fair point.
actually, but I do think that there's an area that we could work with. So my area of academic study is actually media capture in competitive authoritarian regimes. And you know how completely legally, through market mechanisms, allies of these competitive authoritarian regimes, particularly countries like Turkey or Hungary, are taking over media outlets, formerly critical media outlets, and turning them into basically propaganda ministries. So what I wanted to ask was, my question is, there is such an incentive for powerful groups, for ideological agendas to take over these things and run them at loss. I mean, because they're using them not as a media outlet, they're using them as essentially a marketing department, a PR department. Now, a lot of people actually kind of touched on this with their questions earlier, but what do you think can be done against this sort of, I mean, there's so much incentive to use these as PR departments that what can be used to, you know, protect against this? What steps can be used? And, you know, what would you say, you just said a second ago that, you know, Bezos taking over the Post was not a big deal or not, it wasn't as worrisome as you thought it would initially be. What do you think protected the Post and the American media market? What were the factors that isolated it where you don't see it in places like Hungary or Russia or Turkey?
Excellent question. So you're absolutely right that different forms of capture are always a distinct threat, vulnerability to whatever media system we're talking about. The insidious aspect about commercial capture is that in liberal democracies, too often we think that this kind of capture isn't something we need to worry about. So, this idea, again, this kind of market ontology where we assume that the market is this democratic arbiter. So whereas in a less democratic regimes, we see quite clearly, and we call it out, like, oh, that's problematic, that government has captured the news media institutions. So I think that the threats and the dangers are often more subtle, but in some ways no less insidious in democratic contexts. But to go to your question about what can we do to prevent that from happening, there's no easy answer to that. I mean, we need democracy at all levels of society. And that, again, I think that news organizations have been too often insulated. Democracy is something that happens out there, but actually newsrooms, everything should be democratized. So that starts to get at your question, but I would ask you, what do you think? What are the best methods to protect journalists in these dangerous contexts? How are you protected? How do you do your job?
I moved to the other end of the world.
Okay. Okay.
But no, I do have a lot of friends and colleagues who are still struggling. Obviously, there are so many, there's a ton of self-censorship. One of the reasons why I did leave was you can't really do journalism there. Right. Because the second you start doing actual journalism, you're in trouble. Mm-hmm. So you just wind up doing press releases and stuff like that. So but how do you protect yours? How do you prevent this from happening? You can't. It becomes a cascade phenomenon where media just falls and everything. And I'm kind of doing my thesis on this, so I was hoping you'd give me an answer.
I'm sorry. I wish I could. I'm seeing positive signs of more collaboration. So through these collaborative teams, like the Panama Papers. Just journalists from all over the world, and some of them in very dangerous situations, being able to contribute to this amazing journalism. So I think that's one way of being part of a network where you can try to help each other out. But I'm sorry, I wish I had an answer, because this is a wicked problem.
Okay, well, I'll pester you at the meal thing.
Okay.
Playing on something that he did bring up, how do you inoculate against subjective journalism? How do you inoculate against this idea that somebody's opinion presented in the media is equal to actual scientific fact?
Yeah, that's a tough question, and especially you keep hearing people talk about, we're now living in a post-truth era. I don't buy that, first of all, but I don't think that it's just fact checking. I think fact checking is great and important, but I think the damage is already done by the time you try to do fact checking. I just think there needs to be strong institutions that try to countervail against all the misinformation. I don't think subjectivity is in and of itself problematic. I wouldn't even divide between objective and subjective, but it's got to be empirically grounded at some point. So this is I haven't given up. I honestly believe that it's not too late for us to recover some. Even in recent months and over the last couple of years, it's becoming increasingly clear that some of the right-wing outlets in the United States are just merely propagandistic. And a lot of us, that's not a news flash for a lot of people, but that's becoming more of a mainstream, almost like a consensus point. So I'm optimistic that eventually that's going to push back and that there will be a return to some norms. But reasonable people can disagree over that. Yes?
So my question is coming from someone who works as a journalist in Vancouver.
Okay.
What can journalists do to address this issue? What can we do as people who work in the media?
So first off, keep doing what you're doing. Don't leave journalism. That's the first step. The second one, I think that unionizing is a very important step to protect press freedom.
Because I wanted to tie this back to your point about sort of the precarious nature of journalists. So if you're working, not necessarily me, but just journalists in general, if they do face some of these employment pressures, how can they ensure that they're still doing a good job and not just following what they should be writing to keep their job.
Not just providing clickbait and
Yeah, exactly.
doing things that too many journalists are being forced to do.
Or not necessarily even forced, but sort of following like a social agenda of this is how we write about certain topics, and so then you just fall into that easily. Can you guard against that?
And I think this is true not just for journalists, but for all of us, whatever our profession is. It's very difficult to maintain a self-awareness of, some of the norms. So going back to the objectivity, I'm used to critiquing objectivity and historicizing it and showing that actually this was a norm that stemmed from commercial imperatives, especially in the early 1900s, when there was a lot of press criticism and the press was trying to professionalize, didn't want to be regulated, so they adopted objectivity and norms like that. And I oftentimes think that I would like to see among journalists some more self-critique and self-awareness about that in ways that they do internalize these larger power structures. At the same time, so what can you tell us? Like, what do you do to try to maintain autonomy? Or do you feel like you do have autonomy in this? And maybe you don't feel comfortable speaking. This might be recorded, so maybe you can tell me later.
What was the question, sorry?
Oh, just like, what do you do to maintain your own autonomy? Like, what are some of your survival skills?
I think you just have to focus on telling the truth.
Okay. Good. Yes, let's applaud that. Thank you.
Thank you for your lecture. What do you think of the model operated by the British newspaper, The Guardian?
Yes, I'm a big fan. That's a great example of where, first of all, they have the Scott Trust. So they have some support, foundation, philanthropic support. But they're also, you've all read, like at the very end of their pieces, they have this kind of plea, and they've been quite successful in generating a lot of revenue. That's not going to work for small newspapers. That's going to work for The Guardian. That might work for the New York Times, some other big newspapers, but that's not going to work for all outlets. So as much as I'm a fan, and I'd like to see more of those, I ran out of time, so I didn't mention this other model. In Philadelphia right now, the Lenfest Institute has bought up all the major print outlets, and so it's given them this kind of nonprofit umbrella, although the newsrooms themselves are still run for profit. But this hybrid model allows them to focus more on journalism. They've doubled their investigative journalist unit. They've made these diversity hires that are permanent, not just like fellows. So I think it's a good model that we need to try to help encourage, and we can try to encourage through, again, it's never a sexy topic, but changing tax laws, I think, can help facilitate that as well. Yes?
I wondered if, in regards to the problems you talked about today, you had anything to say about the valuing or undervaluing of creative labor.
That's a great question. I mean, personally, I value creative labor, but as a society, I think we undervalue it. And I would point, where's Enda? He's the expert on this. But I think we need to see more protection. We need to see unionization. I think in general it's precarious, and we need to subsidize it. I always think back to the New Deal era in the United States, where they were subsidizing artists and actors, and I feel like in an enlightened society we would be subsidizing the arts in that way. So that's my long answer.
I just wanted to ask, so is there some sort of collective responsibility that's to be placed on the sort of media industry at large for sort of sleepwalking into a scenario where the value of the product news has kind of been placed at zero? And what I mean by that is that, a lot of the issue in terms of like people not paying for news anymore has come from the digitization of news, and we've kind of sleepwalked into the scenario. So I look at the example of, say, the Sun newspaper in the UK, which started off as obviously a paid-for print newspaper, is now available online and has an app format as well. When it first moved online, all its print published articles were available online as well, just for free, as a supplementation for their print news, which is their main revenue source. And then after a few years doing that and kind of seeing the trend of digitization of news, they decided to stick up a paywall, and now you can only get The Sun online through the paywall. But I look at that, and I look at other examples like the Daily Mail, another British newspaper, which has established itself as a lifestyle destination online, as well as a news source both online and in print. And it's now one of the top 5 or top 6 most visited websites in the world after Facebook, Google, YouTube, Wikipedia. So I look at examples like this, and I see that there are institutions that have kind of established themselves as destinations for news, and people are willing to, they place value upon that. But the problem that faces the rest of the news media is that we've set the expectation that news is free, especially online. So is there not some level of responsibility to be placed on the industry at large for setting that standard in the first place?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I actually think that the news industry does get accused of, sometimes it's called the original sin of digital news, is that they didn't charge readers from the get-go, and that we were never culturally conditioned to have to pay for this, and so it devalued news. It's often attributed to a degree of arrogance and incompetence, stupidity. I actually don't think that's all entirely fair. I think actually history shows that a number of news organizations did try various ways to monetize content, and I mean, there are some types of news that really can't be monetized. So I think those paywalls are often only going to work for the largest news organizations, or they might work in situations where you have niche outlets. Again, these membership models are very exciting. You have the Correspondent in the Netherlands that Jay Rosen has been trying to popularize here in the United States. I think in some ways these can be great experiments. These will not get at the news deserts problem. This will not solve the local journalism crisis. And I think in those situations, no matter how creative or thinking into the future these news organizations could have been, they were never going to be able to monetize their content to a level where they could support the journalism that a democracy requires. So I guess I would let them off the hook a little bit. But you're absolutely right. I mean, many people think they deserve a lot of responsibility, that in many ways this was self-inflicted wounds.
I don't by any stretch blame the news industry, but I just think that's something that's worth kind of acknowledging, because news never used to be free.
Yeah, you're absolutely. And they're complicit in their own downfall in many other ways. I mean, instead of investing in newsrooms, they were still trying to get 20% profit margins. Yeah, it's like, I think they're certainly culpable for a lot of their woes. But I also think we need to be honest about the constraints that have always been there. I would blame capitalism before I would blame the journalists themselves. Thank you all.
Thank you to everyone for coming. Let's give a round of applause to Victor. And I'll remind you that there is a reception at the Tech Gallery around the corner. You're more than welcome to come. Please do come. There's going to be food, and you can ask Victor more questions.